On an ordinary Wednesday evening in October 2002, a man pulled into a gas station outside Washington, D.C., thinking about nothing more dramatic than beating rush-hour traffic and getting home in time for dinner. It was that early fall kind of dark, just after 6 p.m., the sky already sliding into navy, the air cool but not yet cold. He stepped out of his car, grabbed the pump, and watched the numbers on the meter tick up. People moved around him like they always did, a delivery driver topping off his tank, a minivan wrangling kids in the back seat, someone grabbing snacks from the little convenience store. He heard a sound like someone had dropped a board in the distance. Or maybe a car backfired on the highway. Then his knees buckled. For a split second he was confused, angry even, thinking he'd just twisted something. He looked down and saw the blood spreading across his shirt. His body slid sideways onto the concrete. People screamed. Someone hit the ground. Someone else started yelling for help, eyes scanning the road, the rooftops, the shadowed tree line, trying to spot the shooter. But there was nothing. No man in a mask. No gunman on a rooftop. No car speeding away from the scene. Just a single bullet, fired from somewhere out there in the dark, transforming an ordinary errand into a war zone. That was what the Washington, D.C. area felt like for 3 weeks in October 2002. You could be pumping gas, loading groceries, walking into school, sitting on a bench, mowing a lawn, reading a book on a restaurant patio. It didn't matter who you were. It didn't matter if you were rich or broke, white or black, young or old. Someone could squeeze a trigger from a distance, and your life, or the life of someone you loved, could end in a heartbeat. The newspapers called it the D.C. Sniper, the Beltway Sniper, the Beltway attacks. At first, no one knew it was actually 2 people. One was a 41-year-old former soldier and father of 3. The other was a 17-year-old kid he'd taken under his wing. Together, they turned the nation's capital into a place where people zigzagged running from their car to the store, crouched behind gas pumps, and looked over their shoulders every time they felt the slightest itch between their shoulder blades. To understand how that happened, and how they were finally caught, we need to rewind. Because the story of the D.C. sniper attacks doesn't actually start in D.C. It starts months earlier, in a string of shootings scattered across the country, so far apart in distance and context that no one recognized them as the opening act of a much larger horror story. In February 2002, in Tacoma, Washington, a 21-year-old woman named Kenya Cook opened the door of her aunt's home and was shot dead on the threshold. The killer had a grudge against her aunt, who'd encouraged his ex-wife to leave him. Cook happened to be the one who answered the door. A month later, in Tucson, Arizona, a 60-year-old man named Jerry Taylor was practicing chip shots alone on a small golf course when a bullet from long range hit him in the chest. No witnesses, no obvious motive, just a single shot from nowhere. That summer, in Hammond, Louisiana, a man changing a tire in a parking lot was shot in the neck. He survived by playing dead after the bullet passed through him. In Clinton, Maryland, a pizzeria owner locking up for the night was shot 6 times outside his restaurant. He lived, but barely. In other cities, other states, there were more incidents, some fatal, some not. They looked like one-off crimes, senseless and unconnected. A domestic dispute turned deadly, a possible robbery, a random shooting on a golf course. Only later would investigators realize they were all pieces of the same puzzle. By the time those puzzle pieces started to line up, it was October 2002, and the Washington, D.C. metro area was about to be hit with something it had never seen before. For viewers who don't know the geography, the D.C. area is really 3 places stitched together. The capital itself, suburban Maryland to the north and east, and northern Virginia to the south and west. All of it is threaded by interstates, the Beltway that loops around the city, I-95 running up and down the east coast, Route 50 cutting across. Gas stations and big-box store parking lots sit right off those roads like little islands of normal life. You pull off, grab what you need, and merge back onto the freeway. On the evening of October 2nd, 2002, people did exactly that. At around 5:20 p.m., someone fired a shot through the front window of a Michael's craft store in Aspen Hill, Maryland. The bullet shattered glass and barely missed a cashier. No one was hit. Managers and customers were shaken, but police chalked it up, at least initially, as a strange but isolated incident. Within an hour, that illusion was gone. At 6:30 p.m., in the parking lot of a Shoppers Food warehouse about a mile away, a 55-year-old analyst named James Martin was walking back to his car with groceries when he was shot and killed. One moment he was doing what all of us do, milk, bread, dinner plans. The next, strangers were kneeling beside him trying to stop bleeding they couldn't stop. People went to bed that night uneasy, but still telling themselves some version of, "It's awful, but it's probably targeted. It's probably not about us." Normalcy bias, our brain's built-in tendency to assume tomorrow will look like yesterday, was doing its job. By mid-morning the next day, that bias was gone. On October 3rd, just after sunrise, the sniper or snipers went to work. At 7:41 a.m., a landscaper named James "Sonny" Buchanan was shot while mowing grass near Rockville Pike. Witnesses saw him stagger, then collapse next to his mower. Half an hour later, a 54-year-old part-time taxi driver, Prem Kumar Walekar, was pumping gas at a station in Rockville when a bullet took his life. Not long after that, a 34-year-old woman named Sarah Ramos was sitting on a bench outside a post office reading a book when she was killed with a single shot to the head. At 9:58 a.m., in Kensington, Maryland, 25-year-old Lori and Louis Rivera was vacuuming her van at a gas station when she was shot. Early that evening, in D.C. itself, 72-year-old retired carpenter Pascal Charlot was walking back to his bus stop after buying groceries when he was gunned down on Georgia Avenue. 5 attacks in about 15 hours. For dead in the space of a morning routine, mowing lawns, filling up the car, sitting on a bench, cleaning out a minivan. By the end of October 3rd, the entire region knew they had a serious problem. Television networks broke into regular programming. Helicopters hovered over crime scenes. Anchors stood in front of gas stations still ringed with yellow tape, talking about a possible sniper, as investigators hurried to collect shell casings and interview witnesses who hadn't seen much of anything. Because that was part of what made this so terrifying. No one saw the shooter. People heard the shots. They saw victims drop. Some caught a glimpse of a white box truck, a dark sedan, a van, a station wagon, the details blurred by distance and panic. But there was no clear image of a suspect. No obvious vantage point, like a rooftop or parking garage. The bullets were coming from somewhere nearby, but also nowhere you could point to. On October 7th, parents in Prince George's County experienced every nightmare scenario at once. At around 8:09 a.m., a 13-year-old boy named Aaron Brown was dropped off outside his middle school in Bowie, Maryland. As he walked toward the building, he was shot in the chest. Teachers and students screamed. Staff rushed him inside and called 911. Aaron survived after emergency surgery, but children in the area got a new message from the world that day. Even your school parking lot is not necessarily safe. At the scene, investigators found something chilling. A tarot card, the death card, left propped nearby with a handwritten message. "Dear policeman, I am God." It was the first clear sign that whoever was doing this wasn't just killing. He was performing. He wanted the police and the public to know there was a mind behind the bullets. Over the next 2 weeks, the attacks continued. A woman loading a car at a Home Depot in Virginia. A man at a gas station near Fredericksburg. People shot in parking lots, on sidewalks, at bus stops. 10 people were killed and 3 critically wounded in the D.C. area alone during that October spree. Meanwhile, all the shootings from earlier in the year, Tacoma, Tucson, Louisiana, that Clinton, Maryland restaurant owner, were still sitting in police files in different states, unsolved and unconnected. Daily life in the D.C. area warped in real time. Gas stations started hanging blue plastic tarps to create makeshift screens, so customers could crouch behind them while they pumped fuel. Parents ducked and weaved as they walked kids into schools. Sports leagues canceled practices and games. Outdoor events were postponed. People joked about running in a zigzag, but when they crossed a parking lot, many actually did. The 24-hour news cycle poured gasoline on the anxiety. Every new shooting was breaking news. Live shots from the scene. Live shots from press conferences. Maps with red dots spreading across the suburbs. Interviews with shaken witnesses and exhausted detectives. America's Most Wanted devoted a full episode to the case. Talk radio and cable shows filled airtime with speculation. Was this terrorism? Was this tied to 9/11 somehow? Was it a homegrown killer? One person or a group? An ex-military sniper? Someone with a political agenda? For investigators, the pressure was unreal. You had local agencies, Montgomery County Police, Prince George's County, Fairfax County, the D.C. Metropolitan Police Department, and federal agencies like the FBI and ATF. Everyone was forming task forces, sharing leads, setting up command centers. They were also drowning in noise. More than 100,000 tips poured in. Every white van in the region suddenly looked suspicious. Early witness reports mentioned a box truck, so law enforcement, and the public, were primed to look for that shape. For days, traffic stops clogged the roads as officers pulled over vans, RVs, and work trucks that happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Somewhere in that flood of data were a few crucial truths. One of them was that this wasn't a lone genius sniper on a rooftop. Those attacks didn't look like carefully planned long-range military shots. They were close enough that someone could fire quickly from a car, or just off the side of a lot, and melt back into traffic. Another was that the same weapon was being used again and again. Ballistics experts had recovered .223 caliber shell casings from several scenes, consistent with a rifle like an AR-15 variant, the kind of weapon lots of shooters and many veterans were familiar with. Comparing microscopic marks on the bullets and casings, they confirmed that the same rifle was responsible for multiple shootings. That meant they were chasing at least one person with a high-powered rifle, strong nerves, and the ability to find and escape scenes in seconds. We know now that there were actually two people, John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo. Their partnership is one of the most disturbing parts of this story. John Muhammad was born John Williams in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in 1960 and grew up in a turbulent home. He served in the U.S. Army, where he trained as a marksman and mechanic. After his service, his life unraveled: failed marriages, custody battles, financial instability. He changed his name after converting to Islam, married a woman named Mildred, and eventually became obsessed with the idea that the system had cheated him out of his kids. In the late 1990s, he ended up in Antigua in the Caribbean, where he met a Jamaican teenager named Lee Malvo and Malvo's mother. Malvo's childhood had been its own maze of instability, moved from relative to relative, pulled between countries, struggling for any kind of anchor. Muhammad stepped into that vacuum. When Malvo's mother left Antigua for Florida, she left Lee with Muhammad temporarily, planning to send for him later. Instead, Muhammad tightened his grip. By 2001, Muhammad and Malvo were living together in Washington state, sometimes in Tacoma, sometimes in Bellingham, bouncing between cheap housing and homeless shelters. Muhammad presented Malvo as his son, enrolling him in high school under a fake name. Malvo, barely 16, clung to him. Muhammad cast himself as a teacher, a father figure, a spiritual guide. He introduced the boy to Islam on his own terms, to his grievances against the government and his ex-wife, to a worldview where the two of them were warriors in a battle no one else understood. He also introduced him to guns. They spent time at a shooting range in Tacoma. Malvo later told investigators that he stole a Bushmaster XM-15 rifle, a civilian AR-15 style gun, from a gun shop and practiced with it. They fired from prone positions, from kneeling, from behind cover. Muhammad had a plan. In Malvo's later testimony, he described it as coming in phases. Phase 1. Spread fear with apparently random shootings around the D.C. area, disrupting daily life and drawing massive media coverage. Phase 2. Use that fear to extort money, millions of dollars, from the government, claiming they would stop the killings if their demands were met. Phase 3. Use that money to set up a compound in Canada where they'd train and house homeless black children in some twisted utopian fantasy. Underneath all of that, investigators believe, was a more personal motive: Muhammad's desire to kill his ex-wife, Mildred, and potentially others around her, and make it look like she was just another random victim of the sniper. In his mind, that would let him regain custody of his children and vanish with them. If you're hearing this and thinking that sounds delusional, that's because it was. But to a 17-year-old kid who'd been isolated, indoctrinated, and told he was chosen, it sounded like mission, purpose, family. Muhammad took it a step further with something incredibly practical and incredibly chilling: the car. He bought a dark blue 1990 Chevrolet Caprice, a retired police cruiser. On the outside, it looked like any other aging sedan, the kind you'd see 100 times a day on I-95. On the inside, he modified it into a mobile hideout. He and Malvo removed the back seat, so someone could crawl into the trunk from inside. They cut a small rectangular hole near the license plate and mounted the rifle inside the trunk, so the barrel could poke out just enough to fire. From the outside, it looked like nothing, just a car parked near a gas station, a rest stop, a shopping center. From the inside, it was a sniper's nest on wheels. One of them could lie prone in the trunk, rifle pointed out the hole. The other could drive, park, act as a spotter, or help them blend in. When you combine that setup with rushed eyewitness reports that focused on box trucks and vans, it's not surprising they were able to move around for as long as they did. While the region freaked out about white vans, the real threat was a blue sedan everyone ignored. Inside the investigation, there were moments of progress and moments where things slid sideways. They were able to link many of the DC area shootings to the same rifle through ballistics. They had the tarot card. They had a note the killers left after one attack demanding money and making threats. They received calls from someone claiming to be the sniper, taunting and asking police to do and say certain things on television. One of those messages included the phrase, "like a duck in a noose," which led to a legendary, strangely cryptic press conference where Montgomery County Police Chief Charles Moose stepped to the mic and repeated those words to the world, hoping the killer would take it as proof they were listening. But investigations like this aren't movies. They're messy, human, and often exhausting. At least twice during the spree, law enforcement had Muhammad and Malvo in their sights and didn't know it. A few days into the attacks, officers in D.C. stopped a blue Chevy Caprice with out-of-state plates for a minor traffic issue, questioned the driver, and let him go. In Baltimore, police checked on a Caprice parked with someone sleeping inside near the Jones Falls Expressway, ran the plates, and moved on. In both cases, the car matched some of the emerging descriptors. But in both cases, nothing screamed, "This is your guy," at the time. The turning point came from somewhere else, a link back to one of those earlier, unconnected shootings. In late October, investigators re-examined the September shooting of that pizzeria owner in Clinton, Maryland. Ballistics testing showed that the bullets from that attack had been fired from the same rifle as the DC sniper shootings. That meant whoever shot the pizzeria owner had probably also been involved in the freeway attacks. They pulled every scrap of information from that case. The owner's stolen credit card had been used hours after the attack in an ATM in Georgia, near Interstate 10. Security footage captured a man who looked like a teenager. At almost the same time, law enforcement in Alabama and federal agents began comparing notes on an unsolved September shooting outside a liquor store in Montgomery, Alabama, where a woman was killed and another wounded in what had initially seemed like a robbery. Ballistics there also matched the DC sniper rifle. At that scene, a witness had noted a dark blue Caprice with New Jersey plates. Now you have a car, a state for the plates, and a trail that stretches from Washington State to Arizona to Louisiana to Alabama to Maryland and finally to D.C. By digging into records, from traffic stops, from that Alabama shooting, from tips about a man named John Muhammad, they started to triangulate. Muhammad had been cited in the past. He had an ex-wife in Maryland, an Army background, a history of custody disputes. He had, at one point, been associated with a Jamaican teenager named Lee Malvo. They ran the plate number from the Alabama tip. It came back to a blue 1990 Chevy Caprice registered to John Muhammad, or to a New Jersey address connected to him. On October 23rd, Chief Moose stepped up to the microphones one more time and asked the public to be on the lookout for a blue Chevy Caprice with New Jersey tags, plate number NDA 21Z. The bolo went out to law enforcement across the region and flashed across TV screens. Less than 24 hours later, just after midnight on October 24th, a man named Whitney Donahue pulled into a rest area off I-70 near Myersville, Maryland, about 70 miles northwest of D.C. He'd heard the description on the news. As he parked, he noticed a blue Chevy Caprice with New Jersey plates sitting nearby. Donahue did something a lot of us hope we'd do in that situation, but aren't sure we really would. He called 911. Troopers from the Maryland State Police rolled in quietly, using unmarked vehicles, and even commandeering a tractor-trailer to block the rest area exits, so no one could leave without going through them. They approached the Caprice, weapons drawn. Inside, they found two people sleeping. One was John Allen Muhammad. The other was 17-year-old Lee Boyd Malvo. In the trunk, they found the Bushmaster rifle, mounted and ready, with the hole near the license plate. They also found a scope, a bipod, ammunition, and other evidence tying them to the crimes. Maps with locations marked, walkie-talkies, more items traced back to victims. The men who'd been paralyzing an entire region were arrested at a highway rest stop in the middle of the night, while truckers slept in their cabs and cars rolled by oblivious on the interstate above. The terror on the freeways of Washington finally had faces. The legal fallout was complex because when you commit murders in multiple states, there are a lot of prosecutors who want a piece of you. Ultimately, Virginia moved first. They charged Muhammad and Malvo in separate cases. Prosecutors painted Muhammad as the mastermind and Malvo as the triggerman in many of the shootings, while Malvo's defense team argued that he was a manipulated juvenile, groomed and controlled by an older man he saw as a father. In 2003, a Virginia jury convicted Muhammad of capital murder for one of the sniper killings. He was sentenced to death. In 2004, he was tried again in another jurisdiction for a separate killing and received a second death sentence. In November 2009, he was executed by lethal injection at the Greensville Correctional Center in Virginia, still insisting on his innocence publicly even as evidence against him was overwhelming. Malvo's path was different. He was 17 during the shootings, legally a minor. He was tried in Virginia first, convicted, and given multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. Later, in Maryland, he pleaded guilty to additional murders and received more life sentences to run consecutively. At one point, he was serving 10 life terms with no possibility of ever getting out. Then the law changed around him. In 2012 and 2016, the U.S. Supreme Court decided in Miller v. Alabama and Montgomery v. Louisiana that mandatory life without parole sentences for juveniles were unconstitutional and that those rulings applied retroactively. Malvo's lawyers challenged his Virginia sentences. As his case, Mathena v. Malvo, made its way to the Supreme Court, Virginia passed its own law in 2020, making most people convicted for crimes committed as minors eligible for parole after 20 years. The Supreme Court dismissed the case as moot. In theory, that means Malvo will be eligible for parole in Virginia, while his Maryland life sentences remain in place unless changed by future legal action. In interviews from prison, Malvo has described himself during the spree as a monster, talked about being indoctrinated, and expressed remorse for the victims and their families. He has also said that Muhammad sexually abused him and used that abuse, along with emotional manipulation, to keep him bound to the mission. None of that erases what he did. It does complicate the picture of the partnership at the center of this case. Because this wasn't just two guys with a rifle. It was a man in his 40s, with training and adult agency, consciously constructing a world in which a teenager saw killing strangers at gas stations as a righteous path, a way to earn love and belonging. It was a teenager who chose to pull a trigger again and again, but who did so in the context of a relationship that, from the outside, looks a lot like grooming, coercive control, and cult-style indoctrination compressed into a two-person bubble. For the people who lived through those 3 weeks in 2002, and for the families of those who didn't, the legal debates and psychological analyses are always going to be secondary to something simpler and harder. 10 people in the D.C. area going about their lives, working, shopping, walking, reading, mowing, were killed. 3 more were critically wounded. 7 additional people were killed and others injured in the earlier shootings across the country. In total, at least 17 dead, 10 wounded, and countless others scarred by loss and fear. If you talk to people who lived in the Washington region then, they'll tell you the sniper attacks rewired the way the city felt, even for people who weren't directly touched by the bullets. People remember crouching behind their gas tanks. They remember kids being rushed from buses into schools under cover of umbrellas, not for rain, but to make them harder to see. They remember Chief Moose's tense press conferences, the endless cable news loops, the phrase "shelter in place," getting used long before COVID made it part of everyone's vocabulary. And they remember the strange, disorienting mix of terror and boredom, days where nothing happened, but everyone was still waiting for the next shot. From a law enforcement perspective, the case ended up being a landmark in several ways. It showcased how critical interagency cooperation is when a crime spree crosses jurisdictions and state lines. It demonstrated the importance of preserving ballistic evidence and building centralized databases, so that shell casings from a pizzeria in Maryland could be matched to a rifle used at a gas station in Virginia months later. It highlighted how hard it is to investigate crimes when the victims are completely random. No shared workplace, no shared social circle, no obvious connection beyond being out in public. The usual, "who would want to hurt this person?" question wasn't helpful when the answer was someone who didn't know them at all. It also showed how the public can be a force multiplier when given the right information at the right time. That bolo for the blue Chevy Caprice wasn't just paperwork. It was the thing that turned a regular driver at a rest stop into the person who helped end a killing spree. At the same time, this case is a study in how fear can distort perception. For days, everyone fixated on white vans and box trucks because early eyewitness accounts mentioned them. That became the mental template. Meanwhile, the real threat was a car no one was thinking about. It's a reminder that our brains like stories that make sense and latch onto the first coherent narrative offered, even if it's wrong. Most of all, though, the DC sniper attacks are a story about the fragility of everyday life. We build our lives on routines: the morning commute, the grocery run, the gas station stop, the way your hand reaches for the pump without thinking. We tell ourselves that if we stick to familiar places and habits, the big random dangers, the plane crash, the terrorist bomb, the sniper, won't land on us. For 3 weeks in 2002, that illusion cracked around Washington, D.C. Every trip to Costco felt a little like stepping onto a battlefield. Every walk across a parking lot was a small act of faith. Today, if you drive those same roads, the Beltway, Route 50, I-95, you won't see anything that screams crime scene. The gas stations have been renovated. The strip malls have new tenants. Kids who weren't even born then pump gas without thinking twice. But if you were there, the memory doesn't vanish. You still might flinch a little when you stand out in the open. You might still remember glancing at the tree line, wondering if someone was watching. And you might remember, too, the night the news finally broke that they'd been caught. That 2 men in a blue sedan had been pulled from a car at a Maryland rest stop, and that at least this particular chapter of fear along the freeway was over. For the families of the victims, the story didn't end there. It moved into courtrooms, parole hearings, anniversaries, and the quiet work of grief. For the rest of us, it left behind a strange kind of double vision. We know, intellectually, that the world can tilt without warning, that a single shot can turn a gas pump into a place of trauma. But we also keep getting up in the morning, driving to work, filling our tanks, walking across parking lots. We live in the shadow of what happened, and we live anyway.